Hi guys, this is Dr. J here, and in this video I will give you a brief introduction to ionic and covalent bonds. So ionic and covalent bonds are two categories of chemical bonds that are formed when atoms lose, gain or share electrons. Okay, so atoms will either lose, gain or share electrons in order to achieve the noble gas configuration. In order to achieve the noble gas configurations, atoms will either lose, gain or share electrons. Why is it important to achieve the noble gas configuration for atoms? Because noble gases have an electron octet, other than helium, of course. And when you have all your valence electrons paired, they are more stable. Okay, electrons are like people. Okay, when they are paired or when they are married, they are more stable. When you have unoccupied valence unpaired valence electrons, they are not very stable. So atoms will try to pair its unpaired valence electrons by either losing, gaining or sharing electrons. So there are two ways that you can achieve the noble gas configuration. One way is through ionic bonds and the other way is through covalent bonds. Okay, so the primary difference between ionic bonds and covalent bonds is that in ionic bonds you have a complete electron transfer from one atom to the other. Okay, so between two atoms you have a complete electron transfer. And in covalent compounds, you don't transfer electrons between atoms. You don't transfer electrons between atoms. Instead, you share electrons. Atoms basically share electrons between atoms. So that is the primary difference. Once again, in ionic bonds or in ionic molecules, you have a complete electron transfer between atoms in order to achieve the noble gas configuration. And in covalent compounds or in covalent bonds, you have atoms sharing electrons between each other in order to achieve the noble gas configuration. So let's first focus on the ionic compounds. So in ionic compounds, you have a complete transfer of electrons between two atoms, which means one atom loses electrons and the other atom gains electrons. So in the elements in the periodic table, you can divide those elements into metals, non-metals and metalloids, right? So when you think about those three types of elements, which type of elements are most likely to lose electrons? Between non-metals and metals, which elements are most likely to lose electrons? Of course, metals are big. Why? Because they have a larger atomic radius. In other words, the electron cloud of metals is large, and therefore the nucleus has a lesser control over its electrons. So when metals have a larger electron cloud and less control of its electron clouds from the nucleus, those electrons are more likely to be lost. Forming a cation. Okay, so metals form a cation. By losing electrons. And when you talk about non-metals are small, and they actually have a good control over the electron cloud. So they are less likely to lose electrons. So non-metals will actually gain electrons. Non-metals will gain electrons and form an anion. Okay, an anion. So the difference between a cation and an anion is that cation is positively charged. It is positively charged. Why? Because you are losing electrons. Okay, cations are formed by the loss of electrons. That is why you are positively charged. And anions are formed by nonmetals. And they are negatively charged. And I'm going to take you to a figure from your textbook and explain this concept in more detail. So in this figure, I'm showing you the formation of an ionic compound and a covalent compound. In your left hand side, you have your ionic compound or ionic bond, and then in here you have your covalent compound in the right. Okay, covalent compound in the right. So as I mentioned earlier, for ionic compounds you have both a metal atom and a non-metal atom involved, and of course the metal atom is big. M stands for metal, and the metal atom is big, so therefore it tends to lose electrons. Okay, so it will lose electrons, and those electrons will be picked up by the greedy smaller non-metal. Okay, so by losing electrons, metal will become a positively charged ion. We call it cation, and the non-metal will gain more electrons. So now you have more electrons as compared to protons, so you are negatively charged. So this is an anion. So once you have a positively charged cation and a negatively charged anion, of course they are oppositely charged, so they are attracted to each other through electrostatic interactions. So they will sit next to each other with very strong electrostatic interactions. So this is how you make an ionic bond. Okay, this is how you make an ionic bond. But in covalent molecules, you have two nonmetals sharing electrons. Okay, so the unique thing about nonmetals is that you share electrons, that is one, and also you only have nonmetals. So two nonmetals share electrons, okay, and then they achieve the noble gas configuration by sharing electrons. So that is the difference between ionic and covalent compounds.